With the hot pot of soup in his hands, he was eating it. It was made by his mother. It was hot and it was tasty. Now, it might have been a dry spring morning, but it was so cold. And this man stood there, taller than anyone else, who was working by the side of the seaside that was wide and rocky. He was eating this to keep the cold away on this spring morning. He wasn't here by accident. He was working here. He was the manager, and he had money in his pocket, and it made him very happy. But he was a good man. He would look out and see just what needed to be done to lay the rails to make the trains go faster. I'm going to put onto the CD so that you can hear this one. Newton Aycliffe, full story. We said where? All he could see in front of him was the seaside. It was wide and it was rocky. He was a man who'd lived here all of his life. He was not a young man, but he was still tall and good. And with all of the work that he had done, he had money in his pocket, and he knew that he was rich. It kept him happy, all of the things that he would do. Now, he might have been old, but his mother, who was even older, would always say to him, "Keep yourself well wrapped up, wear a scarf, make sure that you keep warm." And to make sure that he'd kept warm on this dry spring morning in 2004, she'd given him a pot of hot, tasty soup. He was standing there, looking out, smiling to himself, hearing his mother's words inside of his head, and he thought, I was brought up. Those two houses, one long row of houses, I was brought up in that place. And now they're bringing this train station, this huge, fast train station, and they're leaving the old line alone. He'd spent all of his money to try and make this a place that people would want to visit. And you could see the old train station with weeds growing up in between the tracks. He remembered seeing the men carrying coal for the old train. And as he went inside of a dark, rocky tunnel, he could not believe his eyes. He could see something glinting in what little light was trying to break through on this spring morning. He could see something that glittered and gleamed like gold. He couldn't believe it. Gold! It must have fallen from the old train tracks. The train tracks that had been there since the 1830s. The smile on his face grew wider and brighter, and he picked it up. Each of them felt like small bricks in his hand, and he knew that each one, heavier than lead, could help him to do things. Oh, this high-speed train was going to go to its beautiful new glass and steel station, but he was going to restore the old station so that it wasn't old, it wasn't breaking down, and the weeds were not growing in between the tracks. And it could be closer to the side of the sea. He did not stop himself for a second. He might have been old. He was tall, but he was strong. He'd worked all of his life. And he took the time, and with every spacer that he placed into the old tracks to make that steam train go in that place, the smile grew wider and wider. And soon people came to look at the old train, to look at him standing. Everybody straighten your backs. Standing there at the front of the train, pulling at the whistle and smiling. People might not have known his name, but they knew him by the coal dust on his face, the smell of steam and smoke in the air, and hearing the old train as it went by the side of the sea. Year 2 story, starting with when. On this dry spring morning, this girl was there by the edge of the sea. She was a good girl, about 16 years old. She looked as glamorous as she possibly could. She had money in her pocket, but no smile upon her face. She was a gloomy girl. But if she did have money, she would make sure she would share it with anyone. Living in a shiny new caravan by the side of the rocky beach in Thailand, she would use an elephant to travel to the jungle, where she could hear them cutting down the wood. She had to live here with her grandfather to help him during the day, because the tourists would come, and with the heat of the day, they would always come to his place to buy some ice cream. She looked about her and wondered, Here we go. Starting with who? A story about an elephant starting with who. She was a good girl, about 16 years old, and as glamorous as she could be. Because here, it was always rocky on the beach, but she lived inside of a shiny new caravan, and no matter how much money she had, and she could spend and share, she always felt gloomy. She felt as if she was stuck in this place, and the only chance that she would get to travel would be upon her grandfather's elephant. She would travel to the jungle, and it would make her sad to see how much of the wood was being cut down. Her grandfather looked after her. He would help the tourists. He made ice cream, but one time he'd been one of the men who would cut down the wood in the great jungles. But on this spring morning that was so dry, she just sat herself down and eaten some salty octopus. It was one of the favourite meals that she'd ever had in her life, and her and her grandfather would sit together. But she wanted to go away. She didn't want to be stuck here with the tourists always clamouring because they were so hot and wanting something cold like ice cream. And as she rode on top of the elephant, she straddled across its broad shoulders and she rocked from side to side. Can you do that with me? And she rocked from side to side, and she nearly slipped. But as she started to slip, she could see at the top of the trees something that you would never see if she was walking. She could see some beautiful flowers. She had looked out of a window every night, and she could see birds. She could see birds that looked like geese swaying in amongst the trees. And she scratched at her chin and she rubbed at her head. Can you all do that with me? She scratched at her chin and she rubbed at her head. I can't believe you fell for it. And she looked and she thought, you cannot get geese up in a tree. They cannot fly there. They can't go that high. And she would look by the light of the moon and see these things that swayed backwards and forwards. And what she saw this time, riding on the back of the elephant, she could see that the flowers were shaped like those birds. She smiled to herself. She was a curious girl, and she couldn't stop herself. As she watched these birds that were really flowers, she wondered just what could they possibly taste of. She was frightened. They could well poison her. They could well make her feel so sick. But when she saw birds, other birds, smaller birds, birds that could fly to that place, starting to take some of the flowers, some of them were dropped by the side of a window. She reached out with her fingers. Can you stretch with your fingers like this? She stretched with her fingers. She rubbed her fingers on some of the flowers. She sniffed it. It was the sweetest taste she'd ever smelt in all of her life. So sweet in the air. She stuck out her tongue, do it with me, and she tipped it on the tip of her tongue. It was a taste like nothing she had ever tasted before. It was like custard and apple and sweets and jellies all in one go. And for the first time in her life, the gloomy look upon her lips was gone. Show me. She spread her lips out. She started to smile. If she liked it, other people would like it. And if they liked it enough, they would come to her grandfather's shop and buy the ice cream. It was custard and apple and sweets and jelly and just a hint of chocolate inside of it. And she made some ice cream, but she never told her grandfather. And she gave him some. He laughed. I've never tasted anything like that. It is the most fabulous taste in all of the world. And how did you find it? She said, as I rode on the back of an elephant, going sway from side to side, as I rode on the back, very good, as I rode on the back of the elephant, I saw it there like goose necks sticking out from the jungle where they'd been cutting the trees down. The grandfather looked and smiled. I will sell it to all of the visitors who come to this place, and they will bring us money. And if they bring us money, they can stop them from cutting down the jungle. This girl, always so gloomy, now had more money in her pocket from all of the tourists who fought to try and get some of this sweet-tasting ice cream, and smiled to herself as she helped to plant more trees in the jungle and stop them from cutting down. And all because she rode, can you do it with me, on the back of an elephant.